What's up guys, I'm BTC. With the brand new role queue, we've seen a resurgence of DPS characters, and one of the biggest is Reaper. But he still has a pretty glaring problem. I want to start by showing you a quick clip from the Overwatch League. I know not everybody likes it, but just bear with me because there's a point that I need to make. This is a match between the Paris Eternal and the LA Valiant. The Reaper is used for a total of about 4.5 minutes. Now, Shadow Step is an ability that allows Reaper to quickly relocate to flank and surprise an enemy, or as an occasional escape tool. For these purposes, how many times do you think the Reaper player used Shadow Step during that 4.5 minutes? Is it 3 times, 5 times, 10 times, more? I think the answer is going to surprise a lot of you, but before I tell you what it is, we need to talk a little bit about the character. For some parts of the player base, Reaper has never gone away, and for other parts, the character has been missing for a very long time. In the pro scene, Reaper hasn't been used much at all since Season 3 when we had the Beyblade meta and Ana's Nano Boost still had bonus speed on it. After that was taken away, Reaper just kind of dropped off the map, for at least the pro scene anyways. For everyone else on the competitive ladder, it's a bit of a mixed bag. In the upper brackets, Reaper is generally at the bottom, second only to Bastion for the most part. However, in the lower bracket, Reaper is far more common. He usually sits somewhere in the middle of the pick rates, sometimes a little bit higher, sometimes a little bit lower, but the character is definitely being used. This was increased after the recent buffs to his lifesteal, making the character more difficult for uncoordinated teams to deal with. But even with the increased usage, there's still some big flaws with the character. So where are we now? The 222 role queue has changed things up quite a bit. Obviously, substantial quality of life in that now you know that you're going to have a balanced team instead of just 5 DPS. But which of those DPS are going to be best to use in those 2 slots? And a lot of this depends on what the skill levels of the players are in the match, the level of coordination, and also what team comps are being used. Right now, the 2 strongest comps in the 222 system are Bunker and Dive. 2 of the best DPS for the highest level players are Hanzo and Widowmaker, but also seeing a resurgence of McCree, Mei, and Reaper. Characters like Genji, Doomfist, and Tracer are also popping up as well. That's for the upper bracket though, and they mostly play whatever happens to be the meta at the time. For the lower bracket, it's more of a mix-up. People tend to play whatever they like as opposed to what the characters might be objectively best at the current time. Reaper is certainly going to see an increased pick rate in both the upper and the lower bracket on the competitive ladder. So this is where it gets to be weird because the character is finding some usefulness even among the pro scene, and yet Reaper still has the single worst ability in the entire game, Shadow Step. Remember that clip that I showed you? Do you know what the answer is? How many times that Reaper player used Shadow Step during that entire 4.5 minute round in order to reposition or to flank or to surprise or even to escape? How many times? The answer is 0. 0. The button was never pressed during that entire round. Outside of the spawn room, the button was never pressed. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Shadow Step is meant to quickly reposition to flank or to surprise the enemy, but it's almost never used for that. On rare occasion, when Wraith form is on cooldown, you might see one of these players try to use Shadow Step as an escape tool, but for the most part, it ends in miserable failure. Not that I blame them, mind you, it's not their fault that the ability is terrible. And to be fair, sometimes it does work, but most of the time it doesn't. I went and checked a bunch of the other matches and I found a lot of similar situations among all of these pro-level Reaper players. They never use Shadow Step, or if they do, it's only once or twice. In fact, if you watch these pro matches, you'll see the average number of uses for the Shadow Step is 1 per round. 1 per round. The ultimate is being used more often than Shadow Step, which is just absurd. Can you think of any other character or any other ability in the game that would only get used on average once per match? Roadhog throwing only one hook, Orisa placing only one barrier, or a Tracer using only one blink. It's just ridiculous. Even other abilities that are seemingly bad, like Widowmaker's Venom ability, still get used on a nearly constant basis. Whether it's offensive or defensively being used, that Venom ability is always out there. And her grapple is also constantly being used to reposition or to evade enemies. I want to show you this clip of the first ever Reaper 6K in the Overwatch League. During this round, as you're watching the footage, you'll notice that he just doesn't use Shadow Step in order to reposition himself up onto the high ground or off to the side. He stays with his team, which is what you're supposed to do. It's the most effective strategy. He does try to use Shadow Step once or twice, but it doesn't really go that well. Mostly it seems he used it because Wraith Form was on cooldown and there was just no better option. Again, it's not his fault that the ability is terrible. On the other side of this match, though, is the Seoul Dynasty, and they ended up winning this Busan map, by the way. Their Reaper player only used Shadow Step once during this entire round, and it was more of a kind of convenience lazy thing as opposed to, oh, I actually need to use this ability now, right? He was like, oh, you know, I should probably go up on there. I'm just gonna teleport because it's not really a big deal. I don't feel like walking up the stairs, that sort of deal. Now, at the same time, he ended up using his ultimate twice during that round. So just to emphasize, the ultimate ability was used twice as much as the normal ability, and the normal ability wasn't even really necessary at the time. So a few other important points to make. Yes, pro players occasionally use Shadow Step in order to quickly leave the spawn room, but oftentimes they don't even do that. But even still, that's not the purpose of the ability. That would be like saying the main use of Genji's dash or Reinhardt's charge is to quickly leave the spawn room. We know that's not true. The fact is that, yeah, they have the extra bonus that you get to leave the spawn room a little bit more quickly, but that doesn't count towards the regular use of the ability. So, no, using Shadow Step to leave the spawn room a little bit faster doesn't count. And if it did, then that would be the only real purpose of the ability, which is arguably an even worse scenario to have. I know what some of you might be thinking. Hey, that's the pro scene, and it's different on the competitive ladder. And yes, while that is true, the fact of the matter is, the most effective way for your team to win fights and the match is for your players to stay grouped up, like what you're seeing in the Overwatch League. Running off by yourself to try to do some Rambo flanking mission is always going to be less effective. You still might end up winning the match, but you're also putting your team at a disadvantage by not staying with them. And again, why skate uphill if you don't need to? But this whole situation puts the character into a very awkward place because as it is now with the 2-2-2 roll queue system, Reaper is actually going to be a viable pick, at least in some situations. Mostly it's control point maps. However, even with the recent buffs to Shadow Step, it's still objectively the worst ability in the entire game. For some weird reason, people are trying to say that it's good now. It's not. It's used literally 0 times in some matches. It's not a good ability at all. So what do we do with this? What needs to change? I made a video a while back talking about a Shadow Step replacement. I'll put a link on screen and down below so you can go and check it out. That video has close to 750,000 views right now. The basic idea was to remove the targeting of the Shadow Step ability and instead have it work more like Genji's dash, except it wouldn't do any damage. You would press the button and then you would move straight forward a set distance. Now, unlike Wraith Form or Moira's Fade, you do not have any control over your movement during the ability. You just press the button and then, like Genji's dash, you would move from point A to point B, and it would obviously have to be a little bit slower, but you get the idea. That's how it would work. Now, I know for a fact that Blizzard saw the video because they even made a comment about it and how they were not going to give Reaper anything that would be similar to Tracer's Blink. Now, I wonder what they're thinking right now, that the character is actually being used at the pro level, but you'll see an entire match go by where the ability is not used even a single time. How objectively bad does the ability have to become before Blizzard is willing to admit they made a mistake? Because for anyone that's paying attention, seeing a character not using one of their abilities should be a pretty big signal that something isn't quite right. Again, can you imagine any other character in the game completely avoiding and not using one of their abilities, other than to just simply leave the spawn room a little bit faster? Ultimates are being used 2 or 3 times as often as Shadow Step is. But again, circling back, this brings up the question, well, if they were to change the Shadow Step into something that is useful and not complete and total garbage, then wouldn't he become far too powerful? Right now, I think the best solution would be to probably reduce the strength of the lifesteal passive and to change the Shadow Step to function more like the dash that I mentioned. Because right now, the situation with Reaper is just absurd. He has a ridiculously powerful lifesteal passive that is compensated for by having a hilariously bad teleport. Now, whether or not this gets changed, I think it's almost a certainty that you're going to see Reaper popping up a lot more often. I just think it would be better and less problematic if the character was more evenly balanced. So what do you guys think about Reaper, and what changes do you think he needs? Let me know down below. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see more, subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss anything. Also, come hang out in my Discord server and my Twitch live stream. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters. If you'd like to see what kind of cool VIP rewards you can get, check the links down below. And remember, always blame the controller, because it's never your fault.